Russian officials have accused Ukraine of mounting a sabotage attack on Russian territory. The governor of the Belgorod border region says a counter-terrorism operation is still ongoing. The local headquarters of the Interior Ministry and the FSB security service in the area were reportedly targeted. Kyiv has denied any connection to the attack, insisting that disgruntled Russians revolting against the Kremlin are responsible.
Russia's state media says this footage shows the aftermath of fighting in the Belgorod region. Officials claim that in two separate attacks, houses and administrative buildings were damaged in the towns of Borisovka and Belgorod. They blamed Ukrainian armed forces and said many residents had left the area, either in buses or their own vehicles.
There were 8 people injured. According to information from the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Defense, there were no civilian casualties. Once again, the situation is tense and remains so. A counter-terrorist operation was declared. Many restrictions are in place.
The fighting broke out about 5 kilometres from Russia's border with Ukraine. While Ukraine has been preparing for a counter-offensive for months, Kyiv denied any connection to the attack. Videos posted by armed Russian opposition groups, the Liberty of Russia Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps, indicated they may be responsible.
It's time to put an end to the Kremlin dictatorship. Thank you to all those who support us, who send us donations, who are detonating explosives. Your support reminds us every day of our final goal, Red Square. Be brave and don't be afraid, because we are coming back home. Russia will be free.
The Kremlin said the violence aimed to distract attention from Bakhmut, which Russian forces claim to have captured after more than 9 months of fighting.
Well, these latest developments in the Belgorod region come ahead of a widely expected Ukrainian counteroffensive to push back Russian advances in the east. What will that counteroffensive look like if and when it finally comes? DW's William Glucroft has more.
For months now, the front line in Russia's war in Ukraine has barely budged. Let's have a closer look. Now, while Russia has consolidated positions in the eastern part of the country, Ukraine has been able to hold them there. The cost of doing that in human and material terms has been immense. Intelligence estimates suggest tens of thousands of dead on both sides, if not more. And the front runs more than 650 kilometers in Ukraine's east and south. Now, the no man's land between Russian and Ukrainian forces is littered with fortifications that keep each side at bay. Preventing the Ukrainians from breaking through, well, let's have a look. First, we have a minefield. Behind them, rows of tank traps and other barriers, then more minefields and trenches, the likes of which we haven't seen since World War I, more than a century ago. And behind that, we have trenches big enough for tanks and other vehicles to get trapped in. And all that is hundreds of meters of deadly terrain. So, what to do? Well, clear them out. Military analysts say that Ukraine could use a combination of artillery, air power, and specialized mine-clearing explosives that would clear a path for Ukrainian armor and infantry to pass through. But it would be dangerous by squeezing advancing forces into a corridor that makes speed and firepower decisive. Any let-up could give Russian troops the chance to regroup and push back the counteroffensive. And that would be devastating for Ukrainian forces who have less to throw into this fight than Russia does. Now, there's also a psychological element. There's already evidence that Russian conscripts are poorly trained, equipped, and motivated. A concentrated Ukrainian attack could cause a ripple effect of fear, sparking a chaotic withdrawal. We saw that happen to some degree last year when Ukraine made its first major grab at territory it lost. But many of Ukraine's best fighters have been killed, and that makes a successful counteroffensive far from certain, and unclear how much it will actually help reach the broader goal of ending this war.
Let's get more now from Frank Ledwidge. He's a former military intelligence officer with the British Army. Good to see you, Frank. So, how do you see the Russian and Ukrainian armies stacking up against each other now after more than a year of conflict?
Well, Terry, good morning. By the way, the incidents in Belgorod do ask some questions of how strong Russian defences are, but moving on from there. So let's talk about three things. First, firepower. Second, numbers. And third, equipment. In terms of firepower, the Ukrainians probably have enough for a month or so, I would think, without further reinforcement. And of course, they will be reinforced. And by firepower, as William said there, it's essential that they get artillery dominance, and to the extent they can. I don't think they will be able to do this. Air power as well. But artillery is the key weapon here on this battlefield, as it has been in the past on all the others. Second, numbers. Now, if you're going to prepare an assault, generally speaking, the general rule is you have a 3-to-1 local superiority. In other words, the Ukrainians will have to outnumber, according to the rules, the Russians 3-to-1 in any place they're attacking. They're not going to have that, of course, across the front, but they may be able to assemble that locally. And of course, you don't need that if you're planning. Surprise is good. And of course, it's we're talking here the Russian army. Now, neither army is the army of a year ago. Both have significantly changed, or indeed probably entirely disappeared, last year's army. So in terms of numbers, the Ukrainians can mass, they say, 12 brigades, 12 assault brigades. These are freshly trained. They're well trained. We're probably talking about 80,000 people. They will require armoured mobility in order to exploit any breakthroughs. That means tanks and armoured fighting vehicles. Have the Ukrainians enough? Most of their kit is Russian. It'll be well maintained. The Western gear they have, far less than we're led to believe, a few hundred tanks and armoured fighting vehicles, but they're of a level of superiority way ahead of the Russians. What we're going to see are a series of bite and hold campaigns. We're not going to see one sweeping operation such as we saw in Kyiv last year that William mentioned there.
How will we know, Frank, when Ukraine's much anticipated counteroffensive against the Russian army there has actually begun?
Well, my suspicion is we won't necessarily know. This is highly unlikely, as I said earlier, to be one operation with one great band they're free. That's probably not going to happen. We're going to see a lot of separate operations, I would suggest, to unbalance Russian forces. There'll be perhaps one in the north, one south, even this operation to Belgorod may well be some form of framing operation. Although I doubt it's part of the counteroffensive. We won't know. There are going to be many operations. I suspect history will tell us when it has started rather than the news, if you see what I mean.
Let's go quickly back to the situation in Belgorod you mentioned earlier. At the beginning of the war, Russia claimed that any attack on its territory would cause a major escalation. Do you think, Frank, that will be forthcoming, that escalation in response to what just happened in Belgorod?
No. The Russians are short of options for escalation, both laterally against NATO. I don't think anybody's suggesting here NATO is involved, although it won't stop the Russians from making it up if it suits them. I suspect it doesn't suit them in these circumstances. They can't escalate into Ukraine itself, save by bringing on appalling, from their perspective, retaliation from NATO. That's not going to happen. In terms of depth, in terms of new weaponry, I doubt it very much. We'll hear lots of saber rattling and threats, but I don't think we'll see any visible escalation from our perspective anyway.
Frank, thank you very much. Frank Ledwidge there, former military intelligence officer with the British Army.
Thank you, Terry.
For more, let's speak to DW's Mathias Bölinger in Kyiv. Mathias, what more can you tell us about the fighting reported in Russia's Belgorod region? Is it clear yet who is behind the attacks?
So two groups have claimed responsibility. These are two groups of Russian volunteers who are fighting on the side of Ukraine. There is a bit of, let's say, not really confusion, but secrecy around whether these groups are, how closely these groups are linked to the Ukrainian military. A request that we filed to the Ukrainian military came back with the answer that this was concerning secrets and that I could not answer anything, so no clear distancing there. For the people here in Ukraine, it seems pretty clear that there is some connection. I mean, they entered from Ukrainian territory and they used quite a bit of heavy equipment. So it would be a bit interesting that if Ukraine would not know that some sabotage groups were operating on its territory and running over its borders.
How are people in Ukraine responding to these reports coming out of Belgorod, Mathias?
There's a lot of glee here. Let me quote one example. Podolyak, the advisor to the Ukrainian president, has said that Ukraine has absolutely nothing to do with this and that everybody knows that people can buy tanks in any Russian military shop. That's, of course, a reference to the events 2014 on Crimea, when Putin denied that his soldiers were these green men who were capturing the island, and he said that uniforms could be bought in any military shop. So lots of parallels here. People are calling on international media to call these saboteurs pro-Ukrainian Russian separatists in a reference to how people have called these groups in the Donbas region, who from a Ukrainian perspective were Russian proxies, but who were always called separatists. So lots of Schadenfreude here on these events.
Mathias, stay with us while we take a look at what's happening in Bakhmut. Ukrainian officials say their troops are still holding parts of that eastern city days after Russia claimed complete control. The head of the Wagner group said his forces will leave Bakhmut and expects them to be replaced by regular Russian troops.
Whoever controls Bakhmut is in charge of a wasteland. After 9 months of bloody street fighting and endless bombing, the eastern Ukrainian city has been turned into a mass graveyard. Even the self-proclaimed victors don't plan on staying. After claiming to have taken Bakhmut on Saturday, the head of Russia's Wagner mercenary group said his men would soon leave. In an audio message, Yevgeny Prigozhin said the Russian Defense Ministry would have to replace his private soldiers by June 1st. If there weren't enough personnel, he said Russia's thousands of generals could take their place. It's the latest insult fired off by Prigozhin at Russia's military leadership, an internal power struggle against the backdrop of a very real war. Tens of thousands of soldiers are estimated to have died on all sides in the fight over Bakhmut. Little infrastructure of value appears to remain. Western military analysts say the Battle of Bakhmut has tied up the resources of both armies for months. Now that the main fighting there appears to be over, conflict is expected to flare up elsewhere along the front line.
We'll go back to our correspondent Mathias Bölinger in Kyiv. Mathias, what's the latest word on what's happening now in Bakhmut?
It's very difficult to assess the situation. Many sources, the Ukrainian side, but also some of the international observers, confirm that fighting is still going on, but the question is where exactly. It seems to be really on the fringes, and at the moment it's unclear whether these fights are still on city territory or whether they're really already on the edge outside of the city's judicial borders. Ukraine has been controlling just a tiny bit of Bakhmut lately, and that's the bit that we have been talking about mostly in the past few days, since Prigozhin has said that, and some footage suggests that they've really moved on to the edge of the city. Whether they are having positions there or whether these were just mobile groups that were able to go there and then had been driven back, all that is very difficult to assess at the moment, but we're not talking about, a fight for the control of Bakhmut. We're just talking about a fight by the Russians for full control and by the Ukrainians for having a foothold or keeping the Russian forces engaged in fighting there.
Mathias, thank you very much. Our correspondent Mathias Bölinger in Kyiv.